My Lords, I approach this debate with some hesitation because I cannot claim to be an expert on the subject. And your Lordships have heard so many well-informed and often moving speeches on both sides of the argument today, and I shan't be able to add to that body of knowledge. But what I hope to be able to do is examine what happens when Parliament tries to make laws about matters involving free speech and personal feelings without asking itself the difficult questions involved. Too often, laws are made merely because some people feel very strongly on a subject and wish to give their opinions the force of law. But I want to remind your Lordships of a well-known example from fairly recent history which should be a cautionary tale. In the mid-1980s, there was widespread indignation, chiefly among Conservatives, about how left-wing councils were, as they saw it, wasting money and abusing local government duties to preach all sorts of propaganda, quote, on the rates. This was the era, you will remember, of so-called nuclear-free zones, the militant tendency, Red Ted, Red Ken, and so on. And one of the areas of contention was gay rights. It was reported in the media that left-wing councils and educational authorities were using public money to promote homosexual inclinations and lifestyles among children. Some noble lords may remember a book called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, which was allegedly available in a Haringey school library, though in fact actually it wasn't. Pressure mounted for a law to ban such material in schools. Several Conservatives objected to such an idea. Some argued that it would be an infringement of free speech. Others pointed out that there was no need for legislation on the subject because existing new laws, which gave greater powers to parents and governors, would deal with the problem. No, said the supporters of a possible bill. The offending councils and educational authorities were using the rubric of equal opportunities to smuggle in works which, as one put it, eulogised for 15-year-olds precisely the kind of homosexual acts that give rise to AIDS. Such propaganda must be stopped, they said. In the end, an alliance of those Conservatives who were fed up with the hard left councils and those who wished to enforce traditional moral attitudes prevailed. A private member's bill ran out of time before the 1987 general election, but the Conservative manifesto in that election complained that, quote, in certain cases education is used for political indoctrination and propaganda, sexual propaganda. This stand was thought to have done well on the doorstep. After victory in the election, Mrs. Thatcher, now Prime Minister for the third time, allowed the conversion of the original idea of a private member's bill into an amendment to the local government bill. Hence, the famous, indeed notorious, Section 28 was born. It forbade, quote, the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. There was private consternation within government at this, with some ministers complaining that Section 28 would, quote, proscribe the mere expression of opinion, and others that it would, quote, simply not work. There was public outrage too. In the debate in your Lordship's House, 8 lesbians abseiled from that gallery down to the floor of this House. And it was probably Section 28 which galvanised the British gay rights movement, leading, for example, to the rise of Stonewall in this country. And I should also add that there were no successful prosecutions under the Act. It was repealed in 2003. So it can be said that the whole thing was a failure. And as the noble Baroness Lady Hunt has testified, it did a considerable amount of damage. Your Lordships will have quickly spotted where my argument is heading. It is that attempts at banning so-called conversion therapy risk becoming the mirror image of Section 28. This bill contains many of the same problematic elements. These include the lack of proper evidence of a wide and deep problem, an attack on free speech right, which many noble peers have noted, including notably Baroness Ludford, the failure to use existing laws to find a remedy, if remedy is needed, inattention to how the Act would work in practice, the tendency to use legislation to make an empty moral gesture rather than a useful difference, the tendency to exploit in a political or electoral context a sensitive issue which many regard as a matter of conscience. Well, now, if, as many expect, another party holds the majority in another place before the end of the year, we may even encounter the same shift from a private member's bill to a government measure, which happened in 1987. My Lord, such a repetition of history would show that nothing has been learnt from it. One of the puzzles about this subject, my Lords, is that the present government has given so much countenance to it. Since 2017, in various incarnations and under 3 prime ministers, it has meekly accepted the contentious idea that conversion therapy is a defined reality and a threat. And it has also elided, without understanding the arguments, questions of sexual orientation and questions of gender identity. It's in a muddle and it does not know what to do. And I think this confusion derives in part from its feelings of inherited guilt over Section 28. Surely, my Lords, the best way to assuage such guilt is for the government not to replicate, on one side of the argument, the mistakes its predecessors made on the other. And I feel I can advise this with some confidence because I hereby confess my own error on Section 28, which I supported in the paper I edited at that time. Because I shared the dislike of left-wing councils using schools for propaganda, I was impatient of the practical difficulties involved in the legislation. And I also underrated the sense of threat that laws of this nature can carry with them, which the noble Baroness Hunt has referred to. Then, many gay people felt threatened. Now, with this bill, it is parents, church people, and some professionals in the field who feel threatened. I've studied the story of Section 28, and I hope I've learnt my lesson, and I now apply it more than 30 years later by arguing against this bill today.
Yeah.